Well, it's no secret I like movies. One of my favorite trilogies is Ocean's 11. Anybody Ocean's 11 fan? My favorite is Ocean's 13. That's one of my favorites. And in Ocean's 13, there's the hilarious dice factory strike scene where the Malloy brothers, Turk and Virgil, are leading what looks like a full-blown labor revolt. They're down there to kind of rig some dice. They go in and I'm not going to ruin the movie for you, but the scheme is they're trying to stick it to this man who's trying to and has taken advantage of them, and they're taking up revenge, and they're going to stack the dice. And these guys are down there with the responsibility of making sure that these rigged dice get to Vegas on time. And in the meantime, they lead what's like a full-blown labor revolt. And they are waving sticks and rocks are flying, and one of them's yelling, "They're robbing us, they're robbing us." They're talking like revolutionaries. And when they call Danny Ocean to give him an update on what they need, they're like, "We need 36,000. And Danny's like, "Per worker?" And he's like, "No, total." It's like 36,000. And then, Rusty, who's Danny's sidekick, does the math. He's like, pesos, 36,000 pesos. And they do the math, and it's roughly $3.50 a week more that they're striking for. And Danny just says, "Well, we'll just cut him a check. Just cut him. That's nothing. That's no big deal." I remember my first hourly wage. Some of you remember it was $5.25 an hour. $5.25 an hour. I got a deal. I was like, "You're going to give me $5.50 an hour? Sold. I'll work for you." Earning a wage is important to us. It's important that we get paid for work that we do. Our nation prides itself on its history of protest. We are Protestants who protested an old world religion, and we sought a new world for ourselves, and so we left the old world of Europe and came over here to America, and we wanted to find a new place to worship. We protested the King of England and his taxes that were levied upon us, and we protest in the workplace too. From the 1600s onward, American workers have walked off the jobs, and sometimes we've walked off the jobs over wages that we felt were withheld, sometimes over wage cuts, sometimes we simply just wanted to be treated like people, and so we protested. And what Jesus teaches in this section of Matthew, and what Jesus taught 2 millennia ago, and what his word is speaking to us this morning is just as relevant to us today as it was to these men. Our nation and people around us are still asking these questions. What's fair? What's owed? What's the rate of exchange for my effort? And once you start doing that math, life becomes a transaction. I'll give to you if you give back to me. We do this in relationships. We do this at work. And it's kind of hard to stop because everything begins to feel like a transaction. This seems transactional in our relationships. This seems transactional, and some things are transactional. We have contracts. It's helpful to have an agreed-upon rate of pay for work. And when it comes to what is owed and who is owed, a person's true heart and nature can come out. We see this in deaths when someone has a will and families begin to quarrel over who's owed what. I wanted that dish by Mamaw. That's my dish. That's Mamaw's dish that she promised to me. Well, I want her ladle. I want this. I want that. And you begin to divide up money and property, and people's true heart then comes out. You can begin to see what is owed. When you get into negotiations, our hearts begin to come out because there's something about what is owed to us that gives us not hearts of gratitude, but hearts of grumbling. And Jesus is warning and instructing his disciples about this very easily attainable thing of grumbling and being argumentative about what is owed. And so Jesus wants to orient our hearts and our minds, and that's exactly the emotional world that Jesus is speaking truth here. Look at verse 19, chapter 19, verse 30. Whenever you see repeated phrases or words in the Bible, that's almost always a picture frame. If you read the Gospels and you're like, man, that just got repeated before, what you can know is that when you see the same phrase ahead and behind, that is the author's intent for you to say, hey, what's in the middle? This is a daily bread sandwich. There's lots of things in between, but the point of this section is hinged upon these things. So in verse 30, Jesus ends with, as we saw last week, that many who are first will be last and the last will be first. All are equal. And then Matthew stitches together a parable that shows us the underlining of that statement. And then Jesus ends in verse 16, so the last will be first and the first will be last. This is the point of the parable. The point of the parable that Jesus shares with his disciples is the point that he previously made and has been making, and it's Matthew's literary cue for us to be like, this is important. This is the central meaning of this parable. And so the main thrust of this passage that Jesus, there's lots of symbolism in it, but the main point is that Jesus is saying there's no room for pride in the kingdom of heaven. There is no meritocracy. That's a fancy word for you get what you put in, right? You get paid for your merit. No one earns a thing. No one is considered more valuable than another, no matter how long or how well we use our God-given time, talents, and treasure. Basically, here's a summary. Salvation, Jesus is saying, is a gracious and undeserved gift from God. You're smart people. This is an easy parable to understand. There it is. That's the meaning of the parable. Salvation is a gracious and undeserved gift from God. And while that is the main point, that's the meaning of the parable, there are some things that we need to glean from this story that Jesus gives us. There's a lot of symbolism in here, and some of it's been interpreted many different ways. That's the great thing about parables. Parables are something that you can glean off of things, but once you find the main meaning, then that's kind of your anchors. Like if you can't steer away from the main meaning and begin to come up with truths about Scripture that just don't fit. You can't fit a square into a round hole, right? A round peg into a square hole, a square peg, whatever, a block. You get it, right? You can't do it. So first, let's see some of the broader biblical truths in this parable. Look at verse 1. Jesus says that the kingdom of heaven, so this is about the kingdom of heaven, is like a master of a house. So he's going to paint you a picture and say, this is an image, guys, I'm about to give to you that you can relate to. It's like a man, a master of a house who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. This is, for them hearing this, there's been like, okay, yeah, that's normal everyday life. In first century Palestine, it would not have been at all strange for a teacher to use stories with familiar images to those living in a particular place in a particular town. If I were to say, it's like a man who went down to Wawa, you'd be like, oh yeah, Wawa, I know exactly. You'd picture in your scene, you're in your head, I know what that looks like. So also Jesus is using this image. He constantly uses agricultural images and shepherding imagery to make it easy for these disciples to understand, because that's their context, that's what he's doing. And the point Jesus is trying to make is not a hard point to understand, because he's making a connection that they would easily see. It would also not be strange in first century Palestine for a man who owned his house to own some land as well. He would use it for his better purposes. It might be a little bit of land, it might be a lot of land, but you would not only have a house, but you'd have maybe some free-range chickens. Any of you have some of you I know have free-range chickens. I hope they have not died in this cold snap, Now you have frozen chicken for dinner. A small vineyard owner in first century Palestine could have had a half acre. He could have had a much larger estate. But as the story goes on, it seems like this is a master who has a large estate. And this man he doesn't have a cushy desk job. His livelihood is really hanging on a narrow window. Because what happens is when grapes ripen, you've got to harvest them fast. When tomatoes ripen and they're just at its plumpest, you've got a little bit of time before you plug them, or else they'll start to rot, right? You leave stuff on the vine too long, it's going to rot. In the same way, vineyards were quick to harvest the grapes before they rotted. And then once they're ready, you've got to bring them in fast before the weather or rot or thieves ruin the crop. And so here at daybreak, this master of a house who went out early in the morning, as soon as the sun rose, he went to go hire laborers. Look at verse 2. He says, after agreeing with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. So he goes out to look for laborers. He goes to the marketplace where the day laborers would gather, and these are men who don't have steady work. This owner finds them and makes an agreement. Point number one that Jesus is making, there's an agreement. This master's looking for laborers. He finds laborers and he says, they negotiated. That's what the agreeing is like, hey, tell you what, I'll give you a denarius, which was standard operating procedure. Denarius was a day's work worth of money. And so he sends him into his vineyard. But then we see as the story goes on that as the morning goes, he kind of maybe realizes, this is conjecture, Jesus doesn't flesh this out, but in a vineyard it would make sense that they're not making enough headway, so they need more laborers. They need to keep gathering. He does not have enough workers. And so he goes back mid-morning, noon, mid-afternoon, and every time he goes back and he hires more. Look at verse 3. He says, going out about the third hour, he saw others standing idle. That's a word. Idle means they're just kind of doing nothing. It's past the time when everybody has been hired and they're just, wondering what the next day is going to bring because they needed to work. These hired laborers needed to work. They're not standing around because they're bored. They're standing around because they're looking for work. They're idle. They have no job to do. And they're in the marketplace, and this master goes and he finds them. He says, you go into the marketplace too. And then he goes back again, and he says, you guys, what are you doing? So they went, and out again at the 6th hour, in verse 5. In the 9th hour, he did the same. Jesus doesn't give much detail. He just says, this master keeps going and going and going. And so, it's not that this man is inefficient in his hiring practices. It's the picture that this master has work to do. There's an urgency here. There's a crop to harvest. There's a vineyard that is in need of laborers, and this master is doing what he needs to do to make sure that that harvest comes in, even if it means that he has to keep going back and back and back to the same marketplace to hire more workers. And notice who it is that takes all of the initiative. Look at verse 3. It says, going out about the third hour, he saw, the master. It's like a master who went out. The master went out. Jesus doesn't say these laborers came and knocked on the door and said, hey, I heard you're hiring. Is that true? Yeah, sure, come on. No. The master takes the initiative. He goes out to the marketplace. He goes out and finds them and says, you go. Verse 5, going out again, he did the same. Verse 6, and about the 11th hour, he went out. He. And by the time you get to the 11th hour, the master is really scraping the bottom of the workforce barrel, right? Like, the first guys are, hey, let's agree upon, they're the strong workers. Then he goes and he gets the next laborers, and then they're idle. No one's hired them. Then he gets the next laborers, and he finally gets men who have not been doing anything all day. It's like, there's one more hour to go. You want to work? And he brings them in. He says, you go. These hired men were the least of these. Do you remember that phrase? The least of these? The least of these? These are the least of the least of the least of these, right? And the master is hiring them right up until the 11th hour. He's ready to take on more workmen into the vineyard. When you own your own business, it is an encouragement to men who need a job when you take a risk on them, right? Some of you have been in that position where someone took a risk on you and they're like, you know what? I'll give you a chance. I'll give you that job. And there's some men who are just never going to amount to what we would call a very hard, faithful laborer. Sometimes there are laborers that just show up, they do the bare minimum, and they go. And you get the work done, but they're not really dependable. But there are some men who are on the margins. They're out of jail. They're down and out. And sometimes when men who own businesses like farms or like, construction companies or, there's something that you can offer, that is a kingdom move, is when you give other people the opportunity to work in something where they have a sense of flourishing, where they get paid, they get provided for. These men who are being hired by the master are being provided for so that they can fill their families' mouths, so that they can be, at the very least, alive at the end of the day. The last are those picked last in this parable because no one else wants them. And no one else thinks that they're worth hiring or worth investing in. They are the ignoble, they're the unskilled, the oldest, the weakest, the likely least productive and therefore they're the ones that are ignored. And this master is looking intently for guys just like them. He's got a wide range of those who are skilled laborers and those who are not so skilled, but yet the master takes the initiative in all of them. You see where this is going? Look at verse 8. At sundown, the workday's over. Some of you grew up watching Flintstones. How many of you remember Flintstones? Flintstones, meet the Flintstones. You remember that opening scene where they're all working at the quarry, Fred Flintstone and Barney? They grab the tail of the bird and it screams out, and they're like, Barney jumps off and slides down his... This is memory here. I haven't seen Flintstones in, probably 90 years, and I still remember that scene. And, it's payday. It's the end of the day. The day is over. It's time to relax. Look at verse 8. It says, when evening came, that's sunset, right at dusk. That is, they divided up the day into hours, midday, early, this is the day is over. When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, call the laborers and pay them their wages. Start with the last and then move to the first. The master does something here that would make sure to grab everyone's attention. If you're listening, in first century Palestine, you hear that this master pays them that evening on the spot. That's not generosity. That was normal operating procedure, and especially in Israel. Righteousness in Israel, in the law, said that you had to pay a man for his day's wages. You couldn't hold it over for the next day. You had to hire him and then pay him by the end of the day. This just was the law of Israel. God's law said you don't hold a day's laborer's wages overnight. And it's good that we pay an employee what we owe them for the work, because these men would have needed money. So when Jesus tells this story, everyone in the crowd knows that the setting, the urgency of the harvest. They're like, yeah, there's a vineyard, there's a master. They hire laborers. He's kind of got some sketchy dudes there, but that's standard operating procedure. Okay, at the end of the day, they get paid. And all right, great, got it. Jesus, nothing strange here, nothing out of the ordinary. And then Jesus throws this plot twist. Look at verse 9. When those who were hired about the 11th hour came, each of them received a denarius. What? They what? The 11th hour. They were hired at, what's sunset? Let's say 5 o'clock workday. They were hired at 4:45, and they got a day's wages. And you've been in there since 9 a.m., filling out TPS reports, drinking coffee, making copies, responding to email. You've been working all day, and this guy got paid a denarius? Wait a minute. That's where the record scratches. This master's payment is different. It says that when they were hired, they got a full day's work, and they were hired at the 11th hour. Now, when those hired first, he skips the middle. So this is important. He doesn't go through and hire. He goes to the ones hired last and now to the first. So Jesus is just saying the point here is not the middle guys. It is these first and the last. Okay? What do the ones hired first begin to do? Look at verse 10. They're watching everybody get paid, and they're like, oh man. And you're all thinking it right now, because it happens to all of us, If you've ever worked a job and the boss is like paying everybody like under the table, and he's like, hey, we made some money. And if you've kind of been working all day, you're like, okay, I'm going to get, this guy's getting that much? Dude, we did well today. Bonus! You think you're going to get paid much more. And so the expectations begin to creep in. Well, if they're getting paid that, we're going to get way more. And in the study of parables, there's something called the law of end stress, which means that whatever is stressed at the end of the parable, that's actually the most important point. And that's certainly the case here. Let's pay attention. Look, verse 11. The master's wages are a day's pay for a day's work, and he doles out a day's pay for a day's work. But then the ones who were hired first, on receiving it, their pay, they're the first laborers hired. What do? They grumble. Any good Jew would be like, oh, I've heard that word before. We grumbled in the desert. We grumbled at this. We grumbled at that. Grumble, grumble, grumble. Grumble's not a good word. Grumble is one of those words you're like, bah, you're curmudgeon-y. You can't satisfy anything. It's like, man, You cook this for dinner? Well, go out and make your own food, kid. You know? I know no one in this room does that. You don't complain. Oh, man, like, you're wearing that tonight? Or, grumble, grumble, grumble. In their hearts, they're grumbling, which is not a good word in the Scriptures. And who are they grumbling against? The master. And they say out loud, and they say, these last guys, they worked only 1 hour. You've made them equal to us. That's key. You've made them equal to us. You're essentially saying that they're worth a full day's pay, just like we're worth a full day's pay. How is that possible? Because we've been working and carrying multiple burdens. In a vineyard, there's lots of work to do. Repair the walls. He might have hired a bunch of vineyards to clip grapes, but then once you clip the grapes, if you're making wine, you got to squish the grapes. You got to harvest the grapes. You got to collect the grapes. So there's lots of people doing lots of different work, and lots of dudes all day long were carrying various burdens. And that's not fair. These guys get paid the same as us, and we did most of the work. And so the master's payment here, we see, isn't driven by hours earned. It's driven by his own free will and kindness. That should stand out to you. That should be like, how many of you would like to get paid an unfair wage today? How about it? You're like, sure, yeah, I'd love to do some more work for very little pay. Sign me up, Look what the response is. This master's payment now has been exposed as being not by the hours earned, but his own will, his own free will. They all received the same payment. Even though most of these dudes didn't deserve a full day's wage, they all got the same payment. It's not fair at all. It's not fair. If you're looking for fairness, not fair. This is clearly not fair. So how is this good? It's not fair. But Jesus is saying, but wait a minute, it is still good. Who are the ones that would be most likely to complain? He replied to one of them, verse 13. Listen to what the master says, friend. It's funny how he leads with that. This guy's like, you didn't pay. You're making them equal. And he says, friend. The master says, friend. I'm doing you no wrong. Did you not agree for a denarius? He goes back to the agreement. He says, do you agree to do this? No one here in the parable, he says, take what belongs to you. If I want to do this, if I want to give to you an agreed upon payment, I can do that. That's what you and I agreed to that. If I want to give the same payment, if I want to pull out of my pocket the same payment for somebody else, it's my money. I can do with it what I want. It's my vineyard. Friend, take what you're owed. You're not being underpaid. You agreed to this. It's a fair wage. So what is it that they're grumbling against, really? Look at verse 15. Do you begrudge? That word begrudge there is ophthalmos. Ophthalmos. Many of you who are ophthalmologists, is anybody an ophthalmologist in here? Well, if you were an ophthalmologist, has anybody been to an ophthalmologist? Do you know what an eye doctor? Ah, I see, said the doctor. That word begrudge is the evil eye. That's where we get ophthalmology. It's the eyes. He's basically saying, are you looking at me with that evil eye? Like, you know what the evil eye is? When you look, you know it. Man, you know what the evil eye looks like. You're going to walk through my house with those boots on? I'll take them off, thank you. The evil eye. You did that? The master is saying, why are you looking at me like that? Because out of your heart, remember when Jesus says, your eyes are the lamp to the soul? Eyes to see, ears to hear. Always, are you eyeing me with a heart that is grumbling? Why? Do you have evil intent? You're looking at me with an evil eye because I'm generous? That's what the master is asking. No one's been underpaid, but for sure, they were all paid what they did not deserve. Because remember, they're all standing in the marketplace. What are we going to do today? I don't know. I hope I work. Hey, you. Come here. Hey, you, come here. I don't think the master spoke like that. But, hey, come here. I need to hire you. Okay. What are you doing? What are you doing? All these men were standing, and the master was willing to come and hire them. He was willing to do good for others at the expense of his own wealth, as opposed to the man who comes to Jesus and says, what must I do to earn eternal life? And he had great wealth, unwilling to give it all up for the sake of the kingdom. Here, we see that there's compassion at the heart of this gesture. These last few hires, they're not told that they agreed. They just trusted. The master said, I'll pay you what you're owed. And they trusted them. They said, okay, I'm in. I'm not doing anything. Yeah, that's a good deal for me. These last few hires, they believed that the man would be fair. They didn't negotiate a price. They believed that he would do what was fair. They believed that he would pay them for a fraction of the day's work. They did not expect, the last guys did not expect a denarius pay, but they worked anyway. They responded. And here they received more than they even expected or even knew or deserved. And this highlights the fact that this master is both just and generous. He's not unfair to any one of them. The original agreement was a day's wage for a day's work, and that's what he paid them. They worked, and he paid them. And even here, there's no malice. When they grumble against him, he says, friend. There's no hard feelings. These men who had worked for him all day, they were still his friends. Everything this man is doing is gifting them the opportunity to receive from his hand the blessing of work. Do you remember that? To receive, to be like children, to receive. Are you able to receive this gift of generosity? This is a generous and a just master. And so God's grace and forgiveness, Jesus is pointing out that in this vineyard, it's not ours to met out, it's his. God's grace is his to give. We can certainly assure others of God's grace, but only as workers in the vineyard where we say, you know what? I got paid a denarius, and there's no way I deserve a denarius. I am the least of these. I don't understand why I'm in the vineyard. I don't understand why he would pay me this. I don't know why he would give me this grace or this gift, but he gave it to me, and I am so grateful. That's what a disciple does. A disciple recognizes that they've been given a denarius. What is the denarius? Just do the equation. Denarius equals the grace of God. The denarius, the day's wage page, is the gift of God of salvation for those who would receive it through the one who gives it out to even the least of these. Salvation, for many of us in this world, seems to be like this arithmetic process where we add up all the good deeds and we subtract the bad deeds, right? And then that equals our merit before God. That's most world religions. That's the way your neighbor operates. That's the way some of you struggle to resist in your heart, because you think that if I do all of these good things, I've done a few bad things, but at the end, I'm generally a good person. If I can subtract less of what I've done was good, then I'm good. The math works out. What Jesus is saying, there is no math to this. This is just the free gift of God. What leads us away from a grumbling heart? What keeps us as disciples of Jesus from being tempted to grumble? For those of us who've been, following Jesus for a long time, and we've been struggling, and we're being sanctified. We go through trials and tribulations, and we think, man, is anything that I'm doing worthwhile? Am I making any headway? Is there any point with which this is going to get easier? It's a burden to walk and to pursue Christ for a long time. And, some people might come into the kingdom and then they're gone. They're with the Lord, and they've been a Christian for a short time. A grumbling heart is one that's rooted in the one that says that we merit anything. We think about death row conversions. Sometimes we think about, man, is it possible for somebody to, even the worst of the worst of the worst? You think about men like Ted Bundy, who in the I think it was the late 80s, sat with Ted Dobson. If you look up that online, you'll see Ted Dobson, who was a Christian leader, just recently passed away. He wanted to see what Ted Bundy was thinking and interviewed him. And Ted Bundy professed that he had trusted Christ in jail. And the interview's going on and the lights dim. And the reason the lights dim is because it's on the eve of they're testing the electric chair for him. Do you remember Jeffrey Dahmer? Jeffrey Dahmer professed faith in Christ, that in jail he was shared with some pastor shared the gospel with him, sent him tracts, and encouraged him to point to Christ. And in his last interview, he trusted Christ. He said he trusted Christ. And then eventually was beaten to death in a jail because he was such a wicked, nasty, evil dude. Do we begrudge the mercy given to men like that? Which one of us can stand before God and say, you know what? I'm better than those guys. Which person should God refuse mercy to? Tell me. What is the point of the gospel if it's not good news for the worst of the worst of the worst, who in the last minute of their dying days might look to Christ and say, Lord, have mercy on me. Say like a man on the cross. There was no way to pull himself down from the cross and be like, Jesus, you are the Savior. Can I get down from here and earn a few good deeds so that I might be guaranteed heaven? No, what does Jesus say to him? He says, this day, based on your profession of faith in me, the Master has given you grace, a denarius worth of pay. What's wrong with death row conversions or last-minute cries for mercy? What's wrong with that? If our hearts grumble at those who seem to just kind of cash in on the mercy of God, that's not to say that we don't exemplify a life that pursues Christ and we become sanctified and more like Christ. That doesn't mean we just do whatever we want. I come to Christ in the 80s and I live licentiously. I do whatever I want. That's not what this is about. This is about a genuine heart that looks to the only source of life and mercy and cries out, Lord, have mercy. And for those of us that were hired first, we look at the ones who were hired last and be like, praise be to God, because I'll tell you what, I don't deserve a denarius either. And so in conclusion, this parable, three things that Jesus warns us about and encourages us. One, Jesus warns us against ever thinking that anything we receive from God, especially salvation, comes by merit. God deals with sinners in sheer grace. We have no claim on our salvation. And the fact that God does not treat us according to strict justice is something every sinner should be very profoundly grateful for. You want fair? Do you really want fair? Think about that equation. We do not want fair. We want grace. We want mercy. We don't want justice right away. Justice right away is not the gospel. Second, this parable warns us against comparing ourselves to other laborers in the vineyard. Friends, if you ever look at some more mature Christian and be like, man, I wish God must love them more, or I can't, there's plenty of famous Christians in the world, and there's plenty of people doing great work, but this parable teaches us that we're not to compare ourselves to other laborers in the vineyard. The laborers are members of the kingdom, and the work represents Christian service. And whatever assignment the Lord has given you, moms, your work at home is every bit as equal in the eyes of God to the work of Billy Graham and his evangelistic opportunities throughout the history of the world. Take the most famous Christian and theologian, and your work with your children is just as valuable to God as that is. There's no comparison. The first and the last. There's all equal in the kingdom of heaven. It's all the same job. We're in the same vineyard. We're working. There's work to do. But we're never to compare ourselves. Because when we begin to compare ourselves, we begin to think that the master doesn't love us as much as he loves that person. And the master goes to every single worker and says, you, get in here. You, get in here. You. Yes, you. Ugly one. I'm not pointing to you. You. Even the disciples in his day, the reason why he's talking against these guys is because these men were the least of their day. Think about this. Jesus was an unknown rabbi in Judea. The Pharisees and the Sadducees and all the religious leaders, they're like, Jesus who? And they murder him. And these disciples are aligned. We look back at these disciples and we think, these men are great. Their opportunity, they're awesome. But in their day, they are the least. They're the last ones. Jesus is saying, men, you've not been the prophets of old. You're not Elijah. You're not Isaiah. You're not these men that are high and lofty up in Jerusalem. But you men matter. And I've called you into my vineyard, and there's work to do. So when you get crucified, and when you get martyred, and when you get beaten, and when you get ostracized, and when you get kicked out of town, disciples, men, the 12 of you, remember, it is by God's grace that you're in the vineyard anyway, and you will one day reign over all these people. But right now, as the least of the least, teach other disciples to have this mindset, that there's work to do, that it is by God's grace that we're even in the vineyard, and that we're not to compare to one another our works or our deeds, but we're just simply to be grateful for the fact that God has pulled us into the vineyard. And one day that vineyard is going to be realized, and it's going to be an incredible experience. And you will not care in that day who got paid what, just the fact that you're all there. Right? I often say sometimes, I'm like, man, I hope there's not I don't think we are going to be judged for our works, but I always imagine kind of heaven being like this spinning wheel. We're all in line, and it's just kind of, next, Tom Hudzina, and like everyone's watching, like the person in front of you just been like, here's what you did, like, you're in. You're like, listen, I would like to skip this. Like, we're all, like the second judgment. There's the first judgment where everybody's separated, and then there's what Paul talks about, the bema seat of judgment. And I don't know what that exactly looks like, but we are going to be given rewards for the work that we do. That's where Paul says wood, hay, and stubble. That's why he says each of us has different gifts. Some of you are servants in behind the scenes, and you love doing that. And you would hate and die. You would die if you stood up here. I like doing this. 2 different gifts. We're going to be rewarded for our work because there's work to do. But I always imagine standing up before heaven and before God, and I'm like, listen, if it's at all possible, let's just skip just right to the end. Can I just go in? I don't care. Like, don't review my list, because I'm just glad to be here. I'm just glad to be here. I think we're all going to be glad to be there. And that gives me a grateful heart, because when I'm so discouraged, or when I feel like, man, I'm not doing enough, or I'm not measuring up enough, I just remember, like, man, but I have Christ. I have that denarius worth of pay. That's all that matters. This is the gospel. This is the good news. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Let's pray.